At my wife's funeral, while I could barely stand, my daughter delivered the final stab in the back. In front of everyone, she humiliated me with a disdain I will never forget. "You never worked a day in your life. You'll end up in poverty." She always thought her mother was the genius behind everything and that I was just dead weight. What she didn't know was that her mother was the face of the company, but I was the owner, the real owner. The next morning, when she arrived to claim what she thought was rightfully hers, she was stopped at the door of the own company. The lesson about the value of work was only just beginning. My name is Frank, and at 70 years old, I thought I'd experienced every nuance of pain and joy life had to offer. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the scent of lilies and the soft rain tapping against the stained glass window of the chapel on that fateful day. It was the end of my world, or at least the world as I knew it. Helen, my beloved wife, my partner of 40 years, the public face and vibrant heart of our company, was gone. Beside me, the silence was as heavy as the casket that held her memory. I, as always, was in the background, the silent foundation that allowed her to shine. It was I who whispered the boldest ideas, who planned every strategic move, who ensured that every detail, no matter how small, was in place. It was our arrangement, our secret, the perfect dynamic of a love completed in a ballet of trust and mutual admiration. To the outside world, I was the CEO's husband, the man who never had to work a day in his life, a title Helen always defended with a knowing smile, aware of the truth only we shared. She was the light, and I was the shadow that let her cast it even further. In that moment, as tears rolled freely down my face, mingling with the rain on the chapel windows, I was drowning in a grief that had no name, a pain as vast as the love we felt for each other. Her absence was a hole in my chest, a void that time could never fill. I felt every beat of my own heart as a cruel reminder that hers had stopped. But there, beside the casket, as I buckled under the weight of grief and loss, my daughter, Isabel, the heiress we had prepared her entire life for a grand future, stabbed me in the back. Her words came like a bolt from the blue, a thunderclap that shattered what little peace I had left. "You've never worked a day in your life. You're going to end up with nothing," she said, her voice loud enough for all our relatives and friends to hear every syllable laced with contempt. Her gaze, cold and sharp, was more cutting than the frigid wind outside. There wasn't an ounce of compassion, only an icy thirst for power that, in my fatherly blindness, I had never noticed. "Mum carried you on her back for decades. Now the burden is gone." Every word was a shard of glass in my already broken heart. Isabel humiliated me over my wife's body, not out of grief, but out of an ambition that made me question everything I thought I knew about her. The disdain in her eyes, the way she looked at me as if I were a parasite, a stain on the family's reputation, was unbearable. I, who had laid every brick of that empire, who had dedicated my life to sustaining it, to making it great for her, for us. The accusation of being a burden was an affront that left me breathless. She didn't know, in her youthful arrogance, that the burden was, in fact, the owner of it all. She didn't know that I wasn't the passenger. I was the architect of the ship, the silent captain who navigated treacherous waters while Helen was the compass that pointed north for the world to see. My world collapsed on two fronts: the irreparable loss of Helen and the inconceivable betrayal of my own flesh and blood. The silent promise I made to Helen to protect our legacy became, in that instant, a battle to be fought. The pain of grief merged with a cold fury, a resolve I didn't know I still possessed. I looked at Isabel, and for the first time, I saw a stranger. The next morning, when she arrived to take possession of what she believed was her throne, her empire, reality was about to teach her a lesson. The sun, trying to pierce the grey clouds, seemed reluctant to illuminate what was to come. I Tusney Frankid, the husband who never worked, got out of bed with a renewed purpose, driven by Helen's memory and the need to protect what we had built. Isabel, in her ignorant innocence, thought the game was over. But in truth, it was just beginning. She didn't know that the empire she thought she'd inherited was about to teach her the truth about work, about value, and about the weight of every decision. The company doors, which she imagined would swing open for her like a portal to her reign, would instead be the stage for her first shock. The morning after the funeral dawned with a fog that seemed to mirror my state of mind. I had spent a sleepless night reviewing documents, recalling conversations, and feeling Helen's absence in every corner of our home. The scent of lilies still seemed to cling to the curtains, a painful reminder of our goodbye. But alongside the grief, a steely determination had ignited. I had to act, not just for myself, but for Helen's memory and the legacy we built together. I couldn't let Isabel's blind ambition tarnish everything we had constructed with so much effort and love. I rose before the sun, put on one of my most sober suits, feeling the weight of responsibility in every fiber of the fabric. It was time to reveal the truth. Isabel, on the other hand, arrived at the corporate headquarters like a queen, her posture proud, her chin held high. I imagined her, in her mind, preparing to sit at the president's desk to finally assume what she considered her birthright. She expected reverence, open gates, and red carpets, the immediate recognition of her new status. But life, and particularly business, rarely follows the script we write in our heads. Instead, the head of security, a loyal and discreet man named Mario, whom I'd hired myself over 20 years ago, stopped her at the security turnstile. I clearly remember Mario's expression, a mix of respect for Helen and a veiled sadness at having to follow my protocol. He wasn't a man of many words, but his loyalty was unquestionable. Her keycard had been deactivated. I pictured the panic on her face, the first sign that her world was turning upside down. That expression of shock, mixed with a growing disbelief, would be the start of a series of revelations. She was used to having everything easy, her path paved by Helen's influence, but mostly by my silent dedication. To be denied access by a man she probably saw as a mere employee must have been a blow to her pride. I could almost hear the buzz from the other employees starting to arrive, the curious glances, the whispers spreading like wildfire. Moments later, I arrived. I didn't use the employee entrance as Isabel was used to seeing me do, always discreet, always in the background. This time, I chose the executive entrance, the door that led directly to the core of our power. The security guards, who knew me not just as the CEO's husband, but as the true architect behind the curtain, nodded in a gesture of respect. It wasn't a gesture of submission, but of recognition. It was the kind of respect earned through years of hard work and strategic decisions made in the shadows. "What is the meaning of this?" she screamed, her voice thick with fury and confusion, a tone I had never heard from her, not with that intensity. Her eyes met mine, and in them there was no longer just contempt, but a mixture of anger and fear. She realized that something was drastically different, that the control she believed she had was slipping through her fingers. It was in the boardroom, before the board I had assembled myself over decades, with trusted men and women who had witnessed our growth, that the truth was revealed. I wasn't the supported husband, the man living in his wife's shadow. I was the founder, the anonymous majority shareholder, the strategic mind behind every major move the company had ever made. My wife, Helen, was the brilliant CEO, the public face, the voice that inspired and captivated everyone. But the ownership, the final word, the long-term vision that had always been mine. It was our pact, our well-kept secret, the foundation upon which we built our empire, The room, once silent, now echoed with the impact of my words. The board members, many of them old friends, looked at me with a mixture of understanding and solidarity, knowing I was revealing a secret that came at a high cost. Isabel was in shock. Her arrogance crumbled, exposing a vulnerability I had rarely seen. But what came next would show me that this vulnerability was just the tip of an iceberg of resentment and fury. The battle was just beginning, and I knew she wouldn't back down easily. I had no idea what awaited me, but the future of the company and Helen's memory depended on me. Isabel's reaction to my revelation in the boardroom was not one of shame nor surprise, but a glacial fury that made my bones ache. Her eyes, once filled with panic, now blazed with an intense, almost primal rage. It was as if, in her mind, I had betrayed not her, but the very idea of justice she had cultivated for herself. She didn't see me as the father who had protected her, but as a usurper, a thief, stealing what she felt was rightfully hers. "You can't do this!" she exploded, rising abruptly from her chair, her voice echoing in the still shocked room. "This is a manipulation. Mom would never have allowed this. You tricked her, didn't you? On her deathbed, when she was weak and sick. You forced her to sign papers." The accusations were a low blow, aimed directly at my deepest pain, at the sacred memory of Helen. The board members, silent until then, began to murmur. Some looked at me with pity, others with a subtle question, a doubt planted by Isabel's venomous words. Those words were not just for me, they were for them, to sow discord, to delegitimize the truth I had just laid bare. I felt the air in the room grow heavy, as if the tension were palpable. Mario, the head of security who had been standing discreetly by the door, took a nearly imperceptible step forward, as if anticipating an escalation I momentarily feared. His loyalty was a beacon in the darkness of that moment. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain the calm Helen had always admired in me, the ability to be a rock in a storm. "Isabel," I said, my voice low but firm. Each word carefully weighed. "Everything I own, everything this company represents, was built with my wife, and it was always built on integrity. The documents are valid, and the truth is, I have been the majority shareholder since day one. Your name, as heiress, is in its proper place, but the management and control were always clearly delineated, and Helen knew that better than anyone. I could see in her eyes that the truth didn't matter. All that mattered was the power she felt she had lost. The first twist came swiftly. That very afternoon, before the news of my reappearance could even settle, Isabel filed a lawsuit against me. The claim was exactly what she had screamed in the boardroom, that I had manipulated Helen on her deathbed to seize control of the company, that the documents proving my ownership were fraudulent. I received the notice with a mixture of sorrow and a bitter confirmation that she was willing to go to any lengths. The pain of my daughter's betrayal was compounded by the exhaustion of grief, and as if the legal battle wasn't enough, she used the press. She had her contacts, cultivated over years of association with Helen and her own rise as a director. The newspapers and TV stations began reporting on the family feud for the late CEO's empire. She painted herself as the orphaned daughter, fighting to protect her mother's legacy from a stepfather in father's clothing, who had emerged from the shadows to plunder the fortune. I, the man who had always shunned the spotlight, was thrown into the center of a public scandal. My privacy, which Helen and I had cherished, was shattered. The photos of Helen that I treasured were plastered across the front pages of tabloids, her image used as a weapon by her own daughter. The company, which should have been mourning the loss of its visionary leader, became the center of a media circus. The headlines were sensational, the gossip in the hallways uncontrollable. I felt the stares of the employees, a mix of curiosity, pity, and uncertainty. The image of stability and integrity that Helen and I had so carefully built was being eroded. I called my lawyer, a trusted man and a long-time family friend, and began to map out a strategy for what would be one of the most painful battles of my life. I had to clear my name, and more importantly, Helen's name. But at the end of that exhausting day, as darkness fell outside, I couldn't help but wonder, who else would Isabel convince with her lies? And what would she do next to try to bring me down? The shadow of her ambition seemed to be growing, and I felt that new challenges from within the company itself were about to emerge. The fallout from Isabel's accusations in the press was devastating. Every headline felt like a direct blow, not just to my reputation, but to Helen's very memory. Her photos, once synonymous with success and integrity, were now accompanied by insinuations of manipulation and dark secrets. I, who had always lived in the shadows, found myself exposed to a cruel and unjust public judgment. The phones rang incessantly, long-time friends, some supportive, others with voices laden with an almost morbid curiosity, questioning the validity of my intentions. I felt the weight of suspicious glances, even in places that were once sanctuaries, like the country club where we had played golf for years. It was the first time I had ever felt what it was like to be truly judged, and the feeling was bitter. The pain of grief was already consuming me, and now the pain of slander and misunderstanding was added to it. I spent my nights in the home office, the same one where Helen and I had mapped out the company's future, reviewing old documents and emails. I was searching, perhaps, for some sign, some clue that could explain the virulence of Isabel's attack. How could my own daughter, whom I had loved and raised with such care, see me with so much contempt? It was a chasm I couldn't bridge. The image of Helen, smiling in a photo on my desk, seemed to question me in silence. Where did we go wrong, Frank? That question echoed in my thoughts, finding no answer. The second obstacle, as treacherous as the first, emerged from where I least expected it, but where Isabel had the most influence. The company's board of directors. Using her charisma and the influence she had built over the years as a director, she began to orchestrate a vote of no confidence against me. Isabel had promoted several key executives to positions of power in recent years, and these individuals, who now owed their careers to her, became her pawns on the chessboard. I learned of it through Mario, the head of security, who kept his eyes and ears open, and also from one of the board members, a loyal older gentleman named Edgar, who alerted me with a discreet and worried phone call. Edgar, with his gravelly, experienced voice, told me Isabel was spreading the narrative that my sudden appearance was a sign of instability. She argued that I was a man of the past, a ghost who didn't understand the current dynamics of the market, and that my presence as majority shareholder and, now, ostensibly as leader, would sink the company's future. It was a cunning and dangerous move. She was turning my discretion, my choice to operate behind the scenes, into a weakness, into proof of my incompetence. The executives she had co-opted, likely fearing the loss of their jobs or wanting to secure their positions in the new regime, Isabel promised, were echoing her words. They presented themselves as guardians of modernity and progress, contrasting with the antiquated image she painted of me. The possibility of a vote of no confidence shook me to my core. I had selected these board members with Helen, one by one, over decades, based on their loyalty, competence, and vision. To think that some of them could turn against me, against Helen's legacy, was an even harsher blow. I felt like a general whose own troops were beginning to desert. The company, our professional home, was turning into a battlefield. It wasn't just a matter of power, but of principle. I had to protect what Helen and I had built, not just the material assets, but the values of integrity and hard work. My conversations with Edgar gave me insight into what was happening behind the scenes. He told me about secret meetings, about promises Isabel made to secure votes, about the climate of uncertainty she was planting among the directors. For a moment, it seemed she might succeed. The shadow of defeat loomed over me, heavy and cold. I knew I had to counterattack, but how? How could I face my own daughter on a battlefield where the weapons were loyalty and trust? And where Helen, the one person who could have mediated, was no longer there. The next board meeting would be decisive, a true trial by fire. I needed a strategy, something that could unmask Isabel's true intentions before it was too late. But what could it be, and would it be enough to stop the greed that now consumed my daughter? The answer seemed to lie somewhere in the shadows, waiting to be found. The pressure Isabel was exerting on the board and the press was overwhelming. Every day brought a new battle, a new distorted headline, a new rumor in the company corridors. I felt the stares of the employees, a mix of pity, curiosity, and, in some cases, even a hint of suspicion that wounded me deeply. How could a father be accused of plotting against his own daughter? The question tormented me. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but Helen's memory was my engine. I couldn't afford to falter as I fought to maintain control of the situation. A subtle intuition, a gut feeling that Helen and I had always learned to respect in business, began to bother me. Isabel's haste to neutralize me, to discredit me publicly, seemed excessive, disproportionate to simply inheriting a position. It was more than ambition. There was an urgency, almost a desperation in her actions. This feeling that something else was at play, something hidden beneath the surface of my daughter's fury and wounded pride, began to grow within me. It felt like a chill down my spine, a small voice whispering that there was a darker motive behind this whole orchestration. I decided then to focus my attention on something that had always been my strength, the numbers. Behind the scenes, I had always been the guardian of the finances, the watchful eye on every dollar. Even while Helen shone on the stages of major conferences, I was in the back offices, studying reports, identifying trends, predicting risks. It was my way of ensuring the solidity of our empire. I began to investigate the company's recent financials, the accounting books from the last 2 years. It wasn't a simple task. The records were complex, and I had to be discreet. I asked for help from one of the internal auditors, a man I trusted completely, Peter, who had worked with us for nearly 30 years. He had unwavering loyalty and a keen eye for detecting anomalies. Peter and I met in secret, after hours, in a small records room where no one would bother us. We reviewed every bank statement, every supply contract, every accounting entry. The first few weeks of investigation were tedious, filled with numbers and papers, but the intuition that guided me grew stronger. Something was wrong, small discrepancies that, in isolation, might go unnoticed, but when added together began to form a disturbing pattern. The pen I used to circle the inconsistencies felt like it weighed a ton in my hand, each mark a growing confirmation of my worst suspicions. The discovery, when it finally came, was the third twist, and it struck me like a lightning bolt. It was more painful than I could have imagined. I discovered that Isabel and her fiancé, an ambitious young man named Daniel, had been embezzling funds from the company through inflated contracts. They were using a consulting firm that, after a deeper investigation by Peter, I found belonged to Daniel's father. It was a carefully woven web, a fraud masked by the legality of service agreements. The amounts were exorbitant for the services supposedly rendered, and the payment dates often didn't align with the timeline of any real projects. The confirmation of the fraud sent a deep shock through me. It wasn't just a financial blow. It was a betrayal that tore apart the trust I had in my daughter. The humiliation at the funeral, the accusations in the press, the attempted coup on the board, it all clicked into place. It wasn't just cruelty or unbridled ambition, it was a calculated move to demoralize and destabilize me before I could discover the theft. She wanted to get me out of the way, to silence me, so she could continue her illicit activities with impunity. Isabel's mask had finally fallen, revealing a face I didn't recognize, a cold, calculating face. Rage washed over me, but it wasn't the impetuous anger of a betrayed father. It was a cold, controlled rage, fueled by a clarity of purpose. I had proof, irrefutable proof of her actions. Helen had always taught me that the truth, no matter how painful, would always find a way. Now, I held in my hands not just the defense of my honor, but the responsibility to protect the integrity of the company we had built with so much love. But the question that haunted me was, how did Isabel keep this a secret for so long? And more importantly, to what extent did Helen know or suspect what was happening right under her nose? The answer to that question, I knew, held even more pain and perhaps a revelation that would change everything. The discovery of the embezzlement by Isabel and Daniel opened an even deeper wound in my heart. It wasn't just the pain of losing Helen, nor the public humiliation. It was the realization that my daughter, whom I had taught about integrity and value, had lost herself on a path of greed and dishonesty. The evidence that Peter, my trusted auditor, and I held was irrefutable. Inflated contracts, forged invoices, transfers to accounts of a company ultimately controlled by her fiancé's family. Each document was a shard of glass in my hands. Each number a cruel reminder of the extent of her betrayal. I looked at the reports, at the charts Peter had prepared with his meticulous attention to detail, and felt a lump in my throat. I remembered Isabel as a child, with sun-colored hair, running through the halls of our first company, a small rented room Helen and I shared. She would run her curious fingers over the spreadsheets I left on the table, asking about Daddy's numbers. I would lift her onto my lap and explain, with the patience only a father has, the importance of every cent, the responsibility we had to our clients and the people who worked with us. Her eyes would shine, full of admiration. Where was that little girl? What had turned her into someone capable of such deceit, such cruelty? The image of her innocent laughter contrasted brutally with the cold, calculating expression she now wore. Daniel, her fiancé, seemed to have been the malevolent influence that pushed her into this abyss. I had never fully trusted him. He always seemed too ambitious, with a gleam in his eye that wasn't of a passion for building, but for possessing. Helen, ever the optimist, tried to see the good in him, the youth, the enthusiasm. But I saw the thirst for power, the lack of scruples disguised behind a charming smile. Now, the web of fraud they had woven confirmed my worst fears. He wasn't a life partner. He was an accomplice in a scheme to plunder the legacy we had built with so much sweat and sacrifice. The anger I felt for him was tempered by the sorrow of seeing my daughter entangled in his schemes. The following days were dedicated to consolidating every piece of the puzzle. Peter and I worked tirelessly, assembling a complete dossier with every illicit transaction detailed, every link between Isabel, Daniel, and the consulting firm. The work was exhausting, but each new piece of evidence added to the file brought a painful clarity and a renewed determination. We needed the case to be airtight, irrefutable. The truth was my only weapon, and I needed to sharpen it to its finest point. I could feel the fatigue weighing on me, my eyes burning. But the image of Helen gave me strength. She deserved this justice. While the public battle raged on, with Isabel using the media to defame me, I kept the discovery of the fraud a secret. It was an ace up my sleeve that I needed to play at the right moment, when the impact would be greatest, when I could unmask her once and for all. The atmosphere at the company was tense. Rumors were spreading, and uncertainty hung like a dark cloud. The board members, torn between their loyalty to Helen and to me, the hidden founder, and Isabel's influence, were in a dilemma. I knew some hesitated to support Isabel openly, but the fear of displeasing the rightful heiress kept them silent. I wondered repeatedly how Helen could have missed it. She was so sharp, so attentive. Was it possible that she, in her kindness, didn't want to see the truth? Or had Isabel been so cunning as to deceive her own mother? The thought that Helen might have died without knowing of our daughter's betrayal squeezed my chest, a pang of remorse for not being more present in the practical aspects of management in her final years. But the truth was, our partnership worked differently. She was the face and the voice. I was the brains and the backstage. And she trusted me to take care of everything that was invisible. This question tormented me, eroding what little peace I had. I needed answers, not just for the board, but for my own soul. And the answer, I felt, was somewhere out there, waiting to be found among the memories and belongings of my beloved wife. Where else would I look for a truth that could explain the inexplicable? And what else might I find that could turn the tables so unexpectedly? The discovery of Isabel's fraud, while painful, brought a disturbing clarity. I had the proof, the complete dossier, but there was still a void. A question that gnawed at me from the inside. How could Helen, so sharp, so attentive to the details of the company and of life, have not noticed what her own daughter was doing? That doubt was a heavy shadow that hung over the image I had of her. My Helen, with her light so bright, could she have been blinded by trust or by excessive kindness? The idea that she might have died without knowing of our daughter's betrayal squeezed my chest. A pang of remorse for not having been more present in the practical aspects of management in her final years. I spent hours in our home office, looking at her photos, trying to find a sign, an explanation for the inexplicable. I needed answers, not just for the board, for the company, but for my own soul. I needed to understand, to forgive, if that were the case, or to reaffirm the faith I had in Helen. Where else would I look for a truth that could explain the inexplicable? My eyes suddenly landed on a walnut box she kept on her desk. It was a gift I had given her on our 20th wedding anniversary, a place where she kept small mementos, old letters, love notes we exchanged. There, I thought, perhaps lay a clue, a piece of Helen that could guide me. I began to organize Helen's belongings in her office, a task I had been putting off. As each object brought an overwhelming wave of loss. Every book, every pen, every desk ornament was a piece of her presence, and handling them was like reliving the goodbye with every touch. I touched her reading glasses, still resting on an open book, as if she had just gotten up to get a cup of tea. I felt the texture of her favorite scarf, which she wore on colder days, and the scent of her perfume still seemed to hang in the air, a sweet, familiar ghost. It was a slow, painful but necessary process. Each object was a memory, a flashback to a happy time, and I had to walk through that pain to find peace. I opened drawers, flipped through old photo albums, felt the weight of each memory. In one of the deepest drawers of the walnut desk, hidden under some old papers and correspondence, I found her personal diary. It was a brown, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with time. An intimate object I had never seen before. Helen had always been a very private person regarding her deepest feelings, and I respected that. The box, I now realized, was more than a box of memories. It was a sanctuary for her soul. My heart leapt. The hesitation to open its pages was immense. It felt like invading her soul, a sacred place. But the search for truth was greater than any scruple at that moment. I had to know. With trembling hands, I opened the diary. The first pages were notes on daily life, reflections on the company, on our dreams. There were sentences about Isabel as a child, about her first steps, her first words, a mother's pride overflowing in every line. Tears blurred my vision. But as I read on, the last few pages revealed a different Helen. Her entries became more sparse, more laden with a growing sorrow. And then, on the final pages, she described with a broken heart her increasing disappointment with our daughter's greed and Daniel's bad influence. Helen knew about the embezzlement. Her words, written by hand, in a script I knew so well, were a silent cry of pain and disillusionment. My eyes have been opened, Frank. I didn't want to believe it, but the numbers don't lie. And Daniel's greed, fueled by Isabel's blindness, is consuming us. She described how she had tried to approach Isabel, subtly at first, then more directly, but Isabel always misled her, always denied it, always came up with a convincing excuse. She knew she was being deceived, not just in business, but in the unconditional love she gave her daughter. The last entries were the most shocking. Helen was planning to confront Isabel and Daniel openly, with concrete proof she had gathered herself. She wanted to give Isabel a chance to redeem herself, to correct her mistakes before it was too late. She was determined to clean house, to protect the legacy we built together, but her illness overcame her before she could act. The diary, that small leather notebook, was Helen's voice from beyond the grave, giving me the answers I so desperately sought. It was the proof I needed to unmask Isabel, not just for my own sake, but to honor the memory of the woman who always fought for truth and integrity. The pain mingled with a wave of relief and a renewed fury. I had a new weapon, and I knew exactly how to use it. But what else would this diary reveal about Helen's final days? And how would I use this devastating truth to protect the company and my wife's memory? Helen's diary in my hands was more than a book. It was a window into her soul, a silent testament to her pain and her strength. Every word written on those final pages seemed to echo in the room, mixing with the scent of lilies that stubbornly lingered. The pain of her passing was renewed, but now it was accompanied by a deep admiration and, paradoxically, a sense of relief. She knew my Helen, with her brilliant mind and pure heart, had not been fooled. She had seen the web of lies and was ready to cut the threads. This revelation, though bitter, brought vindication to her memory and renewed strength to me. The tears streaming down my face were a mixture of grief, pride, and a cold fury against Isabel's cowardice. I remember a night, a few months before her illness worsened, when Helen and I were sitting on the porch under the stars. She was quieter than usual, and when I asked what was troubling her, she just sighed. "Frank," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "I get the feeling Isabel is straying from our values. She seems so focused on the material, so seduced by Daniel's promises. I see her changing, and it worries me. Our company, our legacy, isn't just about numbers, it's about how we achieve them." She looked at me with an expression of helplessness that I, in my innocence then, interpreted as a mother's natural concern for her daughter's future. Now, with the diary in hand, her words took on a sinister and painful meaning. She wasn't just worried, she was sensing the betrayal. I held the diary to my chest, feeling the weight of her final confidences. It was as if Helen were there, holding me, guiding me. I could almost hear her voice, soft yet firm, encouraging me to fight for the truth. The weight of her trust, the responsibility to honor her memory, became my beacon in the darkness. I had not just a financial dossier, but an emotional testament. This was the twist that would change the game. News of the diary's existence somehow reached Isabel, perhaps through a curious employee, or maybe Mario, the head of security, let it slip in a moment of stress. It didn't matter how, but the rumor began to spread. Isabel, in her arrogance, downplayed the discovery. I heard from Edgar that she had commented to some board members that it was just another of my desperate tactics, a pathetic attempt to manipulate emotions with old memories. She tried to paint the picture of a senile father, a grieving man, clinging to fantasies to stay in power. But I knew that behind the facade of disdain, there was a pang of concern. She knew the power of Helen's words. While Isabel intensified her campaign of defamation and pressure on the board, I dedicated myself to my own preparations. The hours spent in the office with Peter multiplied. Together, we stitched the financial evidence together with the revelations from Helen's diary. Peter, a man of numbers, was visibly moved as he read the passages my wife had written. His eyes welled up when he read about Helen's sorrow upon realizing her daughter's greed. "She was an incredible woman, Mr. Franklin," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "She always stood for what was right. It would be an honor to help you get justice for her." Peter's loyalty, the way he connected with Helen's memory, gave me even more strength. The idea of presenting Helen's intimate words, the diary she kept so secretly, to a group of men and women in a boardroom was something that tied my stomach in knots. It was like exposing her soul, her vulnerability, her final pain. But there was no other way. I had to unmask Isabel not just as a fraud, but as someone who had betrayed her own mother's trust, who had eroded the values Helen held so dear. It was an emotional sacrifice, but a necessary one. I was defending Helen's honor and the integrity of everything we had built. Isabel, confident in her power and her ability to manipulate the narrative, called for an emergency board meeting. She thought it was her checkmate, the moment to seal my defeat and take her throne. The date was set for 3 days later, a tight deadline that barely gave me time to prepare. But I was ready, or at least I had to be. The eve of the meeting arrived, and I found myself alone in the office, the city lights twinkling outside like small beacons in a dark sea. I held Helen's diary, feeling the weight of the unsaid words, the guarded truths. I looked at the fraud dossier, at the irrefutable evidence, and knew that the next day would be the hardest of my life. I was about to bring down my own daughter, to expose her betrayal before everyone. But how would she react when confronted with her own mother's words, words written with so much pain and love? And would it be enough for the board members, many of them swayed by Isabel, to make the right decision? The answer, I knew, would come at dawn the next day, in the room where the fate of the company and our family would be decided. The boardroom on that day felt like a stage, and I, a reluctant actor in the most important drama of my life. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken expectations and tensions. When I entered, accompanied by Peter and my lawyer, I felt all eyes turned to me. Isabel was already there, seated at the head of the table, flanked by her 2 lawyers, men in sharp suits with cold, calculating expressions. She wore a dark pantsuit, her posture impeccable, but I could see an almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as they rested on the table. Her mouth was set in a hard line, and her eyes shot me a defiant, almost triumphant look. The board members, about 10 people, occupied the other chairs, some with expressions of apprehension, others with a veiled curiosity. Edgar, my loyal friend, gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. The meeting began with Isabel. She stood with remarkable confidence, her voice firm and modulated. Her speech was rehearsed, flawless. She repeated the accusations she had leveled in the press, painting me as a man disoriented by grief, unfit to lead the company. My mother, the visionary Helen, always led this company with unparalleled clarity. Her legacy is at risk if we allow management to fall into the hands of someone who has always been on the sidelines, who has never understood the complexities of our current market, she declared, gesturing with her hands. Her lawyers interjected at strategic moments, presenting legal arguments that attempted to disqualify my position as majority shareholder, suggesting the documents were ambiguous or that Helen, in her final days, was not of sound mind. They tried to create a cloud of doubt over the legitimacy of my claim. I listened in silence, a tight knot in my stomach, but kept my gaze fixed on her. The daughter I knew was no longer in her words, only a cold, calculating strategist. My turn came, and a wave of nervousness hit me. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Helen's diary in my briefcase, the responsibility of her memory. I began by speaking about Helen, about the vision we shared, about the years of hard work to build this company. My voice, though softer than hers, carried the authority of someone who had laid every brick of that empire. I noticed the gazes of the board members beginning to shift, a mix of respect and curiosity replacing the initial apprehension. Then, my voice choked but steady, I moved to the most delicate part. "Gentlemen, and Isabel," I said, looking directly at her, who tried to mask a hint of unease. "There are facts that must be confronted. Facts the press doesn't know, and that, perhaps, not everyone here is aware of." I took the dossier Peter had prepared, a thick stack of documents, and began to present the evidence of the fraud. Charts, bank statements, inflated contracts with Daniel's consulting firm. Every number, every date, every connection was there, undeniable. The murmur in the room grew, and the faces of the board members, once hesitant, now showed shock and indignation. I saw one of Isabel's lawyers whisper something in her ear, his expression tense. She, in turn, tried to remain impassive, but a flush was creeping up her neck. "These documents," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "demonstrate a systematic embezzlement of our company's resources, carried out by Isabel and her fiancé Daniel through fraudulent contracts with a firm that, conveniently, belongs to Daniel's father." The room plunged into a dead silence. Isabel's eyes widened. Her lawyers seemed stunned. The board members exchanged incredulous looks, some with their mouths slightly agape. The fraud was exposed, but I still had one last, more powerful card to play. With my hands still trembling, but driven by a strength that came from Helen, I took out the brown, leather-bound diary. "Finally," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "I want you to hear Helen's voice, the voice of the woman we all loved and respected, the true guardian of this company and its values." The air in the room grew even denser. Isabel looked at me with a mixture of fury and fear, her eyes pleading in a desperate silence for me to stop. But I couldn't. I had to honor Helen. Opening the diary to the last pages, I began to read. Helen's words, describing her growing disappointment with Isabel's greed, her sorrow upon discovering the embezzlement, her plan to confront her before her illness won, filled the room. "My eyes have been opened, Frank. The greed is consuming us." Helen's voice, through me, was present. The boardroom fell into a sepulchral silence. My daughter's betrayal was no longer against me. It was against the sacred memory of the mother she claimed to honor. Isabel collapsed into her chair, her face pale, her eyes fixed on me, a single tear slowly tracing a path down her cheek, revealing not just shock, but a deep pain, a shame she could no longer hide. The vote, which was supposed to be my checkmate, now hung in the air, the fate of the company and of my daughter, suspended by a thread. What happened next was completely out of my control. The silence that settled over the boardroom after I read Helen's final words was the heaviest I have ever experienced. It was not the respectful silence of mourning, but a deafening vacuum, filled only by the echo of my wife's confessions and the murmur of shame. The faces of the board members, once marked by doubt or cunning, now displayed a mixture of shock, sorrow, and in some, a quiet anger. I looked at Isabel. She was broken. Her proud posture had collapsed. Her face was pale and tear-streaked, her gaze fixed on me in a silent plea, a belated recognition of the chasm she had dug for herself. Her lawyers, who had exuded confidence earlier, now looked small and uncertain, exchanging nervous glances and trying in vain to compose themselves. Edgar, who was seated to my right, placed a firm hand on my shoulder. I felt the support, the solidarity of a friend who had witnessed not just a corporate scandal, but a family tragedy. He didn't need to say anything. His gesture spoke for itself. Peter, the auditor, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, the emotion plain on his face. Helen's voice, through her diary, had touched everyone. It was no longer a matter of cold numbers or business strategies. It was the revelation of a betrayal that cut to the soul, a desecration of the memory of a woman everyone deeply admired. The chairman of the board, a respectable white-haired gentleman named Dr. Caldwell, who had worked with Helen for over 30 years, was the first to break the silence. His voice, usually calm and measured, was now choked with emotion. "Isabel," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "do you have anything to say in your defense against the irrefutable evidence of fraud presented by Mr. Franklin and against the words of your own mother?" Isabel slowly lifted her head, her eyes swollen and red. She tried to speak, but the words seemed caught in her throat. A sob escaped her lips, and she shook her head, unable to utter a single word. Her defeat was total, her defense non-existent. Silence was her only answer. Dr. Caldwell then turned to me, his eyes full of respect. "Mr. Franklin, I am deeply sorry you have had to go through all of this, especially at this time of grief. This company's integrity was always Helen's cornerstone, and now we see that you defend it with equal vigor." He paused, looking at each member of the board. "In light of the overwhelming proof of embezzlement, substantiated by the documents presented, and witnessing the profound disappointment of our dear Helen, expressed in her own final words, I see no other alternative. We must act. The company's reputation, our shareholders' trust, our employees' morale, everything is at stake." The vote was called. There was no need for a roll call. It was a moment of painful unanimity. The motion is for the removal of Isabel from her position as director and her immediate expulsion from the board of directors for breach of trust and fraud, Dr. Caldwell announced. Hands went up, one by one, in a gesture that sealed Isabel's fate. I watched, stunned, as each arm was raised, confirming not just my victory, but the bankruptcy of a relationship I thought was unbreakable. There was no joy in the victory, only a profound sorrow. It felt as if, by bringing my daughter down, I was losing a part of myself. Isabel was not only stripped of her position, she was expelled from the board. Her fiancé, Daniel, hadn't shown up for the meeting, but his absence spoke volumes. His involvement in the fraud was undeniable, and the criminal investigation for fraud, which the board now endorsed, became inevitable. The eyes of the board members, especially those Isabel had tried to co-opt, now looked at me with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. They knew they had been on the verge of a terrible mistake, of betraying Helen's memory. As the meeting concluded and the board members began to disperse, Isabel remained seated, her head bowed, her body slumped in defeat. She looked like a marble statue sculpted from pain. I felt a pang of pity, a remnant of the father who had loved her unconditionally, even in the face of her betrayal. But justice and the defense of Helen's legacy had to be served. I walked over to her, and she lifted her eyes, her red, swollen orbs fixed on mine. She was no longer the arrogant heiress, the cold strategist. She was a woman stripped of everything, broken by the truth. And in the silence of that room, I wondered, what would I say to my daughter? How could a father forgive such a betrayal, or was forgiveness even possible? The answer to that question seemed as uncertain as the future that stretched out before us. What I would do next, not just for the company, but for our shattered family, was the hardest challenge I had ever faced. That night, the boardroom, which had witnessed Isabel's downfall, remained silent after everyone but the two of us had left. I watched her, still seated, her body hunched in defeat, and a wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. The pain of a father watching his daughter fall apart was almost unbearable. It felt as if my own flesh were being torn. But at the same time, the image of Helen, her words in the diary, the pain she had felt, burned in my mind, fueling a resolve that wouldn't let me yield. I approached the table, my footsteps echoing in the quiet room, and stood before her. Isabel looked up, her eyes watery and swollen, and what I saw there was no longer fury or arrogance. There was genuine remorse, a shame so deep it seemed to be suffocating her. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her voice was choked, perhaps from crying, perhaps from the weight of her guilt. I saw the little girl I used to hold on my lap, the teenager full of dreams, and my heart ached. How did we get to this point? How did love and trust curdle into such a betrayal? The question that had haunted me for days now seemed to have a visible answer in my daughter's ravaged face. "Isabel," I began, my voice hoarse with contained emotion, "you didn't just betray me. You betrayed your mother's memory. You eroded the foundation of everything we built on integrity and hard work," she sobbed, shrinking further into her chair. I could feel the chasm between us, an impassable valley of disappointment and hurt. This wasn't an argument, not a debate. It was the cold acknowledgement of a truth we both knew. Her lawyers had already left, leaving her alone to face the consequences of her choices. Daniel, her fiancé, had vanished without a trace as soon as the evidence of fraud was presented. I learned from Mario, who did a quick check after the meeting, that he was no longer in the building and his phone was off. His cowardice was yet another facet of this nightmare. Daniel's flight, though expected, intensified the weight of the situation on Isabel. She had been drawn into a scheme, yes, but she had also actively participated. There was no denying her responsibility. "Daniel is gone," I said, my voice a little softer, sensing the void this information would leave in her. She nodded, a fresh wave of tears streaming down her face. It was as if, on top of losing everything else, she had also lost the person in whom she had placed her trust, or at least her ambition. Her loneliness was palpable. I stepped back, needing clarity, needing space to breathe. Peter and Edgar were waiting for me in my office, ready to discuss the next legal steps and the company's restructuring. The criminal investigation for fraud was inevitable, and I knew Isabel would face serious consequences. But the thought of seeing my daughter in court, of Helen's name being dragged through the mud of the legal system again, terrified me. I wondered what Helen would do, how she would act in such a dilemma. Her compassion was endless, but her belief in justice was unshakable. I turned back to Isabel, my eyes fixed on hers. "I'm not going to leave you with nothing, as you predicted for me," I said, recalling her cruel words at the funeral. "But you will have to face the consequences of your actions. I cannot allow the fraud to go unpunished, nor can I allow your mother's memory to be stained." The air in the room felt thin, each word hanging between us. My decision was the hardest of my entire life. I was standing on the edge of a cliff with the future of our company, our family and Isabel herself in my hands. What would I offer her, and what would her answer be? The choice, I knew, would not be easy for either of us. But a decision had to be made, and I needed to be ready for the impact it would have on our lives. The line between justice and forgiveness, between father and businessman, was razor thin, and I felt I was about to step on it. The silence in the boardroom was so thick I could hear my own heart beating. Isabel remained hunched over, her body trembling slightly, and her red, swollen eyes were a reflection of the hurricane consuming her from within. The rage I had felt moments before began to give way to a deep sorrow, a father's pain mixed with the bitter need for justice. I approached her again, feeling the weight of each step, the dilemma between being a father and being the protector of Helen's legacy. My mind reeled with the image of Helen, her voice in the diary, her determination to confront the truth, and I knew I couldn't run from my responsibility. "Isabel," I began, my voice a little calmer but still laden with undeniable gravity, "I cannot and will not ignore what you did, not just for the financial damage to the company, but for the betrayal of your mother's trust, of the values she held so dear. She lifted her head, and I could see a flash of desperation in her eyes. The criminal investigation for fraud is unavoidable. The board has already authorized it, and the police will be notified. You will face justice for your crimes, Isabel. It is what the law requires and what the integrity of this company demands. Those words, harsh and cold, seemed to strike her like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, a muffled groan escaping her lips. I could see the terror on her face, the stark realization of the reality closing in. The life of privilege, the position of power, the reputation she valued so much, it was all crumbling before her eyes. It was the materialization of her worst nightmare, the end of the world she had built on lies and ambition. But there was a part of me, the father who still loved her, who couldn't simply watch her be dragged into the shadows without offering one last chance, a chance for redemption, for a new beginning. It was a risk, an ethical dilemma. But the memory of Helen, who always believed in people's capacity for transformation, spurred me on. Helen, in her diary, had expressed a desire to confront her, to give her the opportunity to change. I had to try. However, I continued, and the words seemed to hang in the air, freighted with a faint hope, there is a choice. A single choice I can offer you, not as your father in the role of the victim, but as the guardian of Helen's legacy and this company's future. She opened her eyes, a spark of curiosity mixed with her despair. Her gaze locked onto mine, searching for any sign of clemency, any crack in the wall of my resolve. You have two options, Isabel, I said, my voice now firmer, without hesitation. The first is to face justice for your crimes. The evidence is overwhelming, and the legal consequences will be severe. Your name will be publicly disgraced. Your reputation irreparably destroyed, she shuddered. The second option is a chance to start over. I am offering you a position as a junior assistant at one of our subsidiaries, in a remote town, far from here. The proposal caught her by surprise. She blinked, as if she hadn't understood. Junior assistant, she whispered, her voice barely audible, a mix of disbelief and perhaps a remnant of wounded pride. She, the ambitious director, the caress, starting from scratch in a menial role. It was a shock to her self-esteem. Yes, junior assistant, I reinforced, my tone unchanging. No privileges, no protection of your name, no shadow of the parent company. You will have to learn the value of work, of effort, of honesty from the ground up. You will live on a modest salary, pay your own bills, build your own path without shortcuts and without the influence you used so freely to manipulate. It will be a life of hard work and humility, something you have, apparently, never had to experience. Silence reigned once more. This time, however, it was a silence of deep reflection, of an internal battle being waged in her mind. She stared into the void, at the floor, at her trembling hands. I saw the scales in her head. On one side, public shame, prison, total destruction. On the other, a life of hard work, without glamour, but with a chance for redemption. To rebuild her life, her dignity, far from the spotlight and its temptations. It was a choice between total ruin and a difficult path to recovery. The decision hung in the air, suspended by the weight of her own actions. My heart ached, but I knew this was the only way to honor Helen and perhaps to save what was left of my daughter. What would she choose? The path of destruction or the difficult road to redemption? The answer would change everything, forever. The air in the room seemed suspended, each second an eternity, as Isabel pondered her choice. Her eyes, once filled with despair, now revealed a deep reflection, an internal battle between her wounded pride and the harsh reality that surrounded her. I watched her in silence, my own heart aching, awaiting her answer. There was no way to predict what she would choose. The path to redemption was arduous, and the path to ruin a tempting abyss. The fate of our family, and, in a way, Helen's final lesson depended on that moment. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, she raised her head. Her voice came as a whisper, almost inaudible, but filled with a humility I had never heard from her before. I accept," she said, the words escaping like a sigh. "I'll take the job. I'll start over." There were no tears now, only a profound resignation, a bitter acceptance of her fate. Her eyes met mine, and in them, for the first time in a long time, I saw a glimmer of something more than ambition or contempt. I saw a spark of hope, perhaps even genuine remorse. It was a small, almost imperceptible step, but it was a step. My breath escaped me, a relief I hadn't realized I was holding. There was no triumphant joy in me, only a soft sadness and the feeling that, perhaps, Helen's love had not been in vain. I knew her path would be long and difficult, a true journey of self-discovery and recovery, but the seed of change had been planted. The next morning, the company awoke to a new dawn. The news spread quickly. Isabel had been removed from the board, and I, Frank, the silent founder, had taken the reins. But most importantly, the criminal investigation for fraud, which had once seemed inevitable, was suspended. My decision to offer Isabel a second chance, while controversial to some, was justified by the promise that she would step away from the main company and start a new life in another town, far from any influence or privilege. I didn't want Helen's name dragged through a criminal scandal involving her own daughter. It was a way of protecting her, of honoring her memory and the legacy of integrity we had built. I called a meeting with the board members. I explained my decision not to press criminal charges, emphasizing that Isabel would accept the penalty of hard, humble work, a life lesson I hoped would transform her. There were discussions, of course. Some board members expressed concern about the company's image, about the message it would send. But Dr. Caldwell, with his wisdom, intervened. Mr. Franklin is not only administering justice, but also exercising mercy. And above all, he is defending the memory of Helen, who always believed in redemption. The company, with your leadership, Mr. Franklin, will rise again with greater strength and integrity. His voice brought a calm to the room. The vote to support my decision to offer Isabel a path to redemption without the shackles of the criminal justice system was unanimous. Later that week, Isabel left. There were no dramatic goodbyes, just a brief, painful meeting between a father and daughter at my home. Her eyes still bore the mark of pain, but there was also a newfound determination. "I know it won't be easy," she said, her voice choked, "but I'm going to try. I'm going to learn." I hugged her, an awkward embrace, heavy with years of both love and pain. "Start again, my daughter. Find your own worth, your own dignity. Helen would be proud if you did." It wasn't a goodbye, but a new beginning, a new chapter for both of us, written with the hope that time and hard work could heal the wounds. In the silence of my office, I looked at Helen's picture. The evidence of fraud was filed away. Isabel's decision was made, and the company was safe, once again in my hands. The main conflicts were resolved, but the wound in my heart still ached. I had gotten my company back, but my relationship with my daughter was in ruins, waiting to be rebuilt, brick by brick. The legal battle was over. The truth had prevailed, but the emotional journey was just beginning. I wondered, would the humility of work and the distance from privilege be enough to transform Isabel? And would I ever be able to forgive her completely, to heal the scars this experience had left on my soul? The answer hung in the air, an invitation to the future, to healing, and to a true understanding of the legacy Helen left us. The months following Isabel's departure were a period of rebuilding, for both me and the company. The scent of lilies in the chapel, The humiliation at the funeral, the sting of betrayal, all those memories, though still present, began to transform into valuable lessons. My grief for Helen, which I had postponed amidst the battle, could finally be experienced in its fullness, with the certainty that her honor had been defended and her legacy preserved. I took the helm of the company openly, for the first time in my professional life, and I felt the weight of responsibility, but also the joy of realizing the vision Helen and I had built together. It wasn't a burden, but a purpose. My routine changed drastically. I, the man from the shadows, was now in the spotlight, leading meetings, inspiring teams, and making strategic decisions publicly. With every step, I felt Helen's silent presence, as if she were whispering advice in my ear, encouraging me. The company, shaken by the scandal, rose again with renewed strength. The truth, when revealed, had shocked many, but it also solidified the trust of loyal employees and board members. They saw not just a father who sought justice, but a leader who defended integrity and ethical values above all else. Peter, the auditor, and Edgar, the board member, became my right-hand men, their eyes filled with respect and admiration. We restored confidence, implemented new control mechanisms, and reaffirmed our commitment to transparency and social responsibility. It wasn't just about profits, but about how we generated them, about the impact we had on the world. The empire of Helen and Frank, now under my direct leadership, flourished again, stronger and more conscious of its purpose. Isabel, for her part, kept in sporadic contact. Initially, her letters were short, formal, describing the hardships of her job at a small subsidiary in a remote town. I read between the lines of her struggle, the frustration of a woman accustomed to luxury and power, now facing the reality of a modest salary and no privileges. She could no longer use her last name to open doors. She had to prove herself every day. As a father, it pained me, but I knew it was a necessary process for her own transformation. Life, in its wisdom, was teaching her the lesson that Helen and I had tried to impart for years, without success. About a year after she left, I received a phone call. It was Isabel. Her voice, once harsh and full of resentment, was now softer, more mature. She told me about the challenge of learning every role, from the most basic, about the importance of teamwork, of valuing every colleague. She spoke of the pride she felt when she received her first raise based on merit, not influence. "Dad," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I get it. I really get what it means to build something, the value of work, and I am so sorry for everything I did." Her words were the sweetest melody I could have heard, the echo of the forgiveness I so wanted to grant. In that moment, listening to her voice on the other end of the line, I felt a knot in my throat loosen. The anger, the hurt, the disappointment. It all began to fade, giving way to a deep compassion and a father's unwavering love. It wasn't an immediate return to our former intimacy, but it was a new beginning, a bridge that she, through her own effort, had built between us. She didn't ask to come back, didn't ask for privileges. She simply expressed gratitude for the chance and for what she was learning. That was the moment of unexpected transformation, the satisfying conclusion I had longed for. Today, Isabel is still at the subsidiary, progressing slowly but with dignity and a new purpose. She sends me emails with ideas, with suggestions for improvement, showing an engagement and a passion I had never seen in her. This isn't the old Isabel, thirsty for power. This is a new woman, humble, hard-working, and most importantly, full of integrity. And I, Frank, the husband who never had to work a day in his life, have found my own peace. In the silence of my office, looking at Helen's picture, I understood that the true legacy we built was not one of wealth or power, but of values. A lesson that my daughter now had a lifetime to learn, and that I, in the end, also needed to revisit. Life teaches us that even in our greatest losses, it is possible to find the strength to start over, to forgive, and to build a future where human connection and personal growth prevail. Helen would have smiled,